all yours.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you both to Shin and Sven for putting this all together, and for everyone for coming after a long day. I'm going to share my screen. Does everyone see a slide that says how to cook a tiger?
Yep.
Great. So my talk this evening is a little bit experimental, and it's called How to Cook a Tiger. So thank you for listening to this experiment. In her book, How to Cook a Wolf, the food writer MFK Fisher encourages Americans beset by World War II rations and scarcity to cultivate a certain kind of spirit and to listen into the embodied realm. And in her book, she writes, "You must cultivate your own innate sense of what you must do with the resources that you have to keep the wolf from snuffing too hungrily through the keyhole." So I want to explore with you this evening the pleasure of cooking a tiger as a way of talking about transformation, power, transition, and a kind of alchemy, which have been recently on my mind. Cooking a tiger is similar to cooking a wolf, though we are faced with its own particulars. So sitting where you are or standing, taking a breath as you have arrived in this collective virtual space, I invite you to close your eyes. I invite you to let the light of the screen wash over you while signal and noise pass around you. There is an image on the screen that you have no desire to see right now, as you have your eyes closed. It is an image, a sharp ray of light in the center of your vision. And imagine this light passing to the side, warm and tender. It travels behind you, to your left, and back to the center of your vision. And with your eyes closed, imagine for a moment a tiger. And to focus on the object of our evening, a tiger, imagine its legs, its face, the traces of a white beard, its stripes, its furs, speck of soil and mud, its eye, a black-lined fur surrounding a light brown orb, and at the center is a black marble. This marble, a surface of reflection, a surface through which worlds are seen. And what does this surface reflect back to you? And what does it absorb? So now if you have your eyes closed, please open them. And so this evening is really, some of the themes that I've been thinking about is kind of a virtual cooking space. And I'll share some of the recipes that I've improvised and encountered. I don't know about you, but I'm in this period of transition and reflection, and I'll be sharing some recent work. My practice is generally pretty slow and research-based. And the center of my studio practice for me is really the kitchen fire, the hearth, the kitchen table is this kind of sacred space where I think theory is really created and built from the ground up, where materials are constantly being transformed and designed. It's also a space of nourishment and care, right? It's often neglected and dismissed by the traditional canon of patriarchal design theory, who see the kitchen as a kind of feminized space and the labor of cooking as like very lowly. The kitchen also reminds us that any work we do is ultimately collectively built, layered, and done through countless conversations. It requires us to think of lineage as well. So who do we make work for in this lifetime, in previous lifetimes, and to the next? And to quote the scholar Meredith Alberta Palmer, who do we claim as the people in our lineage and who claims us? So I'll actually start off with my mentor then, who technically absolved themselves of a name some time ago. And is a project that they are doing about kind of statelessness. And they're referred to by the name Helen Mira. They created this manifesto, Cathartes, which I signed, and it's this kind of pledge that is based on the artist Douglas Hubler's idea: the world is full of objects, more or less interesting, and I do not wish to add any more at the expense of other subjects. And so it's really trying to challenge and think through what it means to be in cultural production today, especially this time of crisis, right? Where we spent enormous amounts of electricity training our neural networks on paper space, and we buy dozens of cables for like a one-time exhibit install. And, as part of this manifesto, it says, we remember that for a very long time, artists have made works without relying on burning oil extracted from earth. And so included in this thinking is thinking through the materiality of computing and the ways that speculation might also provide a pathway into thinking through what, different types of materials within computing. So I'll start with the first kind of recent work. I'm actually curious how many folks here know how the word engineer entered as a vocation. If you do, feel free to drop it into the chat. It actually comes from, as Ruth Oldenziel, the historian, documents, it originated from Thorsten Veblen, who is an economist and sociologist. And so at the time, there was really no distinction between craft and engineering. But since we're in a capitalist economy, it really depends on the division of labor and certain people's labor being worth more, right? And so Veblen wrote about this new class of people making things, this class of people called engineers. And this was contrasted against people who are making crafts, basically anyone who is not a man and, doing things like arts and crafts or making quilts and things like that. This thread of engineering and work, and much of how our world is this kind of agreed upon fiction written by people in power, is what we try to address at Logic School. So I'm currently the lead steward for Logic School, which is a 12-week online community-driven school for tech workers. The school is supported with enormous mentorship with Dorothy Santos from Processing Foundation and Clarissa Redwine of the Kickstarter Oral History Project. And so what I mean by tech workers ranges from engineers all the way to product designers to gig workers. And the reason why I say community driven is that the curriculum and activities are really shaped by the cohort. So the 12 weeks has a really project-based focus, and each person actually proposes a final project and works on it. And our first class is spent on, being in this kind of really different space than, day-to-day engineering work. The first class is spent on creating these community agreements, very much central to the part of building communities. So here's an example. And I think it shows the ways that a classroom can be this kind of practicing some things that we might talk about in the abstract. So things like thinking through accountability, thinking about harm. So, we often say things like, let's hold people accountable, but if you think about it, is that also a practice that cultivates consent? So the flip side is like, how can we build these community spaces where people feel comfortable enough to take accountability? And I acknowledge that, there has to be an existing relationship first, right? Much of what we begin from in Logic School draws upon the work of people like Mariam Kaba, Maya Mingus, who write a lot about transformative justice practices. And actually one of our guest lecturers, Anuj Bandari of Liminal Lab, he always reminds us that, harm and conflict will happen, but how do we build these spaces that can hold harm? So I think of building spaces like this, especially like these tangential to the tech industry spaces, as a kind of, kitchen table, right, where people can come together. And we focus at Logic School on both reforming the current tech industry as well as building new kinds of tech and tech tangential spaces. So we also read work on a range of topics from racial capitalism to abolition science. And mostly we focus on, having people show up like how they can from wherever they are. And there's more information if you want to listen to folks talk about their projects. I got to shout out the amazing projects of the folks that were part of the first cohort, Looking Glass, creating Vision, and that's an alternate version of East Liberty in Pittsburgh, rethinking gentrification, celebrating Black life. The Gig Workers Collective, Willie Solis, continued to organize there during his time at Logic School, and also a lot of amazing sex-positive content created by Nichelle Hall for girls online ages 11 to 14, and trying to think through internet safety education in a way that isn't about shame or reinforcing these kind of problematic norms. So one of the projects that I'm currently in the process of still doing, and the reason why is that, the center of it is really creating these workshops and these workshop spaces, is the future of memory. And the future of memory is a collaborative project along with Tian Yi and also Jasmine Wang. And it thinks about how language has become the medium in which activism not only arises, but that there's also this growing trend of not only automated censorship, but collecting our words online as a form of training data. It's inspired by the existing practices of online users in China. So this paper is really great if you're interested in learning more. But for example, in Chinese, like each component of a character, it's called a radical. And so the radical has meaning. And by remixing different radicals, you can create these new words that have very potent political power and also bypass automated censorship. This is an example from the paper of a character referring to CY Liang, who was the chief executive in Hong Kong during the first Umbrella Revolution. Also rethinking the ways that these characters, were created by people who had power to do so, right? Like when I think about my grandmother growing up in Chinese society in like the 1930s, like she was not taught to read and write. And so, who gets to make these new words now, and how can we shift it to, the world that we want to see? Some of the previous work surrounding this was me making these digital objects that had censored words and slogans on them, and thinking of them as objects that could circulate in virtual space, right? So like World of Warcraft, other places, you could even like send them over WeChat, which is this messaging system used widely in China. This has like a Hong Kong related protest slogan embedded into mahjong tiles. And this was kind of this early prototype of the future of memory, where it was really this like kind of space where you could explore these digital objects. And so starting to think more too about just based on the research of Pip Thornton's work, which is really like about how all these, everything that we're posting online, it ends up being scraped somehow to, be part of natural language processing, or used to also like automate censorship itself. And how these kind of systems of profit and moderation and censorship are interlinked. So the site, which is thefutureofmemory.online, it has kind of these multiple components to it, but the center, one of them is, this game made in Twine, where you play this content moderator. And the kind of center of it is really this algorithmic censorship resistance toolkit. So we have both the Chinese homophone search, which is like, for example, in Chinese, rice bunny, which is rice is me, and then bunny is tu. like that's me too, if you put it together. And it kind of, is this way of like pushing against maybe hashtags that are censored. The crux of it is really this Hans the Maker tool, which you can start to use radicals and put them together to make these new words, especially for words that express something that didn't exist or like wasn't thought about 10 years ago. And so that's why we've kind of titled this The Future of Memory. And also thinking too, right, there's this great short science fiction story whose author I can't remember at the moment, but it's kind of this world in which there's so many words that are censored that people have nothing to say anymore. There's no possibility of language. So these characters, are a play on censored words and us using different radicals and like putting them into 3D orientation. And we hold workshops. We actually have one coming up tomorrow that this is an example of words that folks have made. A lot of these words are made by people who actually don't speak any Chinese or have no knowledge of written Chinese. So it's been really incredible just to see the massive amounts of creativity that come out of this. And so I'll just try to speed through the rest of this and we can address anything else in the questions. But so, futurist recipes, which are a part of my book, Blockchain Chicken Farm, and thinking through how, traditional Chinese medicine or traditional Taoist medicine, as it's known by some, it has a totally different understanding of the body. And what does that mean for technology, right? Because so much of the body, or when we think of artificial intelligence and kind of its genesis through cybernetics, Norbert Wiener's work, it's really centered around the brain. But if we have a different body system in which the brain isn't the center of all thinking, what happens? So we have things like AI porridge, which is, this kind of chimera of different organs coming together to produce AI. Then we have other recipes like red roasted pigtail, which is a world in which industrial hog farming has become so prevalent that pigtails become a delicacy because they currently are actually trying to genetically engineer out the pigtails because pigs bite each other's tails off when they're stressed. And moon maize mooncakes, as we try to solve this kind of question of food and food production, which is actually happening now by folks thinking about not only mining the moon for material, but also growing crops on the moon. And finally, data storage soy milk. Since data storage actually has a huge environmental impact. There's a lot of research currently done by at Microsoft and other places around ways to store our data into the DNA of bacteria. And this recipe speculates, what if we do it for soybeans? And what if you could literally eat, your own data? Is it like eating yourself in some way? Some other recent work that I've been really thinking on is, really the microscopic. My background as a geographer, I think a lot about how we see things and perceive things and the power surrounding that, right? And the ways that mapping and the kind of traditional map that we think about, the world atlas, that is imbued with so many different distortions, of both how it is, a distortion that you have to take this 3D object and put it into 2 dimensions, and the power behind that. And so I've become really interested in the microscopic, and this is actually a very short film that I made using a microscope. And that microscope is actually made by a friend of mine, Jeff Warren, and he makes these amazing microscopes that can literally allow you to take video, and it's very DIY, And so you feel like very connected to this object of seeing. And also in relation to this, thinking through, I'm very interested in these notions of care, of connection, of herbalism even, and I'm starting to play around with this process of natural dyeing on fabric using herbs and other like heritage seeds or heritage grown herbs. And so for those who might not know, heritage seed is like when you're literally saving seeds like from this season for the next. And so I think there's this beautiful arc of, again, lineage and transmission and like, the ways that things are shaped by their environment that happens over time in this really particular way with heritage seeds. So I did recently publish a book that some of you have read, Blockchain Chicken Farm, and thank you for reading it. I hope that it was entertaining and, if anything, provided some pretty good mooncake recipes, which you may or may not have recently used. The book was really very much inspired by, in 2011, 2012, I started actually researching, I think at the time I was really interested in infrastructure and thinking through the places that shape our material world. So this is Erdenet, Mongolia in 2011, and it's at the time and continues to be Asia's largest copper mine. And all of that copper, it's forms our modern world, like what we live under, right? Cables, it's in our computers everywhere. And to just see this kind of vast scale was both terrifying and also very, it sparked something in me. And in that sense, when we think of Mongolia, we think of it as like really strange, or well, some of us might think of it as like strange, far away, it's just like to the edges. It seems like so distant from us. And for me, with Blockchain Chicken Farm, I really wanted to challenge this kind of metronormativity, this term from queer theorist Jack Halberstam, which describes kind of like this very urban-centric way of living. And this binary, right, this total binary from city and countryside. And I was recently listening to actually this great podcast called Countryside Queers. And the host of it was describing, they were saying like binaries are killing us. Just the ways that we imagine the rural and that we imagine the urban as so counter, like there's just so much complexity that needs to be told. And it's this very urgent thing, not just in North America or the US, but globally. And there's so many threads in there, right? Not only in North America with indigenous groups, but like globally with the flow of the material that shapes our daily lives. Much of the book actually started off in Shenzhen, which is a city. And when I was there, David Lee, the head of the Shenzhen Open Innovation Lab, he basically told me like, oh, if you're writing a book about tech in China, there's nothing interesting in the city. You should go to the countryside because that's where things they're actually interesting. And you'll see this whole dimension of not only tech in China, but also tech in the US. And so really this book, throughout the research process, it kind of subverted my ideas around, what made in China meant, both on a personal level, because I think, as much as I try to question this idea of the nation state, like there's of course going to be like personal identity attached to the nation, right? And so the book also follows these different kind of chapters or these different cases throughout rural tech in China. So one of them is the use case of AI farming pigs, which goes back to the industrial hog farm, the red braised pigtails that I mentioned earlier. And in these industrial hog farms where AI is being used to farm pigs, it's kind of like this one narrative that's being told that AI is the solution to this question of, meat demand, all these things. But actually, it's really just this way to increase like consumer demand, basically, like to create cheap pork. And this has enormous consequences for, not only the pigs themselves, but also the environment and the ecology of these areas more broadly. There's a really good book by Rob Wallace called Big Farms Make Big Flu, which is all about how industrial farms, they increase disease transfer or zoonotic diseases, so things like avian flu, et cetera. And to kind of see tech step in to accelerate this even more, especially through the guise of like AI for good, has really peeled away the layers, I think, to me, in a lot of the like AI ethics discourse. I also head to a e-commerce village. So for some of you who are familiar with the landscape of Chinese e-commerce, a Taobao village is a village in which people manufacture things for Taobao.com, this e-commerce website, and it's this really incredible setup where it's a family workshop in the front, and in the back they still have their agricultural fields. In some ways, it's kind of like gig farming, which is really strange. But you also have these really complex set of material conditions happening, right? So you have this kind of layer of e-commerce, of Taobao. You have the sellers who go on it, hoping that doing this will allow them to work from their hometowns and get rich, send their kids to school, do all these things. And then you also have these broader structural forces that are at play, right? The fact that you have more privatization, less social benefits in China happening. You have all these private tech companies coming in. And so I think to me, being around the e-commerce village, it was also really this kind of moment where it was like, oh, so much of, what we imagine China to be is also this kind of imagination of the West. And when you're in China, there's also this kind of, imagined catch-up game to the West that's happening. Like, oh, the US has these big e-commerce companies. They're so powerful. Like, let's emulate that. And so there's just this continuous center of power that kind of stays there, right? That surrounds big tech, quite honestly. I also visited a pearl farm, which was, as a researcher, just really fascinating process of tracing. I stumbled across these pearl parties. People were super obsessed with this person, Christy, who held these oyster opening parties online. And she would, open these oysters. There would be a pearl inside, and it would kind of be this guessing game of what's in the oyster. And so tracing where these oysters came from, I ended up at a pearl farm in Zhejiang. And it was just fascinating to kind of see the different threads of connection, right? That we are so materially connected in all these ways, despite, these kind of narratives of nationalism. And I think with this, I really think a lot about this, threaded throughout all of this is really trying to understand there's this kind of constructed sense of the future, right? Who has the right to the future and who is left to steward the present. So, especially with things like Taobao or things like Facebook, all these kind of networks or, these platforms that say, that they're going to bring, alleviate poverty, allow people to become entrepreneurs. All of these dreams, underneath, there's still labor involved. There's still geographic periphery involved. There's still copper mines and data centers. And I think a lot about how much work we have if we do commit not only to the project of revolution and radical change, but also who ends up doing the work when we come to radical change. So to end, I would like to actually return to my original prompt, which is how to cook a tiger. So one last time, if you close your eyes, whether you're standing, whether you're sitting, just close your eyes for a moment and let us return to the image of the tiger's eye, the light brown, the inset marble of black. Stare into it and slowly let your gaze soften. Allow the thoughts in your head to gently meander and allow a sensation from the back of your head, a warm sensation loosening and traveling along your ears to the top of your head, all the way to your forehead, right between your eyes. Let yourself settle into this state, into the suspended state that is the void. Neither here nor there, neither past nor future. Let images emerge. It's in these images that exist between worlds, the imagined and the material, that power finds its way. The power and the way that it writes fictions, which we live with now. There's so many mismatches that I also encountered, whether it's my urban understandings in time, whether it's the fact that there were 9 days in a week sometimes in the villages that I traveled to. If we live in a world where time travel is apparently possible by going through multiple understandings of time, going back to villages, what happens when there are multiple understandings of technology? If we embrace multitudes, what happens to the desire for a singular future, for reassurance, or even a desire for certainty? So keeping your eyes closed, bring the tiger's eye back into vision and think about and see its silken fur, its legs and paws. The most important part of cooking a tiger is realizing that the tiger is not real. It will never be a tiger. It will never be anything but a mirror of appearances, reflecting back and forth. It is a series of endless reflections that can only exist when let go. For letting it go makes it stay. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm left almost speechless. A rare occurrence. Xiaowei, on my way over, well, not way over, my way home to get on Zoom, I ran into a faculty member, John Sharp, who was sitting in front of a cafe near Parsons. And he sent a question for you, which was, how do you cook a tiger? And I'm not kidding. He wanted to find out more about the project. So for you to come here tonight and frame your entire presentation around it was pretty cool when you started talking. I suspect here that there are going to be a lot of questions from the audience, so I'm not going to intervene until necessary. People can raise their hand. They can enter questions into the chat. Let's go for it. Who's got something to ask Xiaowei? From RT, we're getting the question, could you talk a little bit more about feeding AI?
Absolutely. So thank you for so how to feed an AI. It was both a real dinner and also a recipe. And so I feel like there's just a set of themes that churn around in my head for a little bit. The real dinner was a dinner held at Babe Lab Gallery in Oakland. And it was trying to think of, we think of AI as like this kind of singular, like single human intelligence, like if we create this robot that acts like a human, but actually, there's a lot of other computer scientists who do write about this kind of more collectivized intelligence, right? This situated learning, as the writer Jean Lave talks about. And so the How to Feed an AI dinner was all about, like, at the beginning, you literally couldn't eat until you fed the person next to you because they had your spoon. And so it was this kind of, that was this reoccurring theme throughout the dinner. The recipe itself, the speculative recipe, because in Chinese or Taoist medicine, the 11 crucial organs don't include the brain. And so, like if you're stressed out, it's actually like going to be your liver that's inflamed. It was, speculating that there's this AI winter, and the AI winter is actually solved because Chinese scientists start creating this like 11 organ sort of biological / robot that comes together. But because it doesn't have the usual like skin organs for, getting qi or the vital life force into it, they had to like create all these like very qi nourishing foods to feed to this like new AI life form. So yeah, that was my two threads of how to feed an AI. Thank you for asking that.
I want to ask you to return to a comment you made in passing at the very start about your work happening very slowly. Just say something more about that.
So I think this was influenced because, I went to design school. And I think in design culture, there's always this kind of, you do the charrettes, you stay up late, you're trying to like, iterate as much as possible in this very short amount of time. And I think there's, definitely advantages to that kind of working style. More recently, I think, for me, the process, so writing the book, Blockchain Chicken Farm, that took, 3 years. And at the same time, it's like when you're writing a book on tech, there's this sense of urgency that you need to like finish it as soon as possible because tech is changing and the thing you're writing about, it's, going to be so old by the time the book comes out. But I actually think that, having that realization of not wanting to constantly catch up, it really forced me to ask like the deeper questions and to really look into history, right? Instead of about being like, what's the next thing? What's the future? What's the impact of this new technology? I looked into history and you're like, whoa, like we're kind of just, listening to the same record in some variation in so many forms, right? And how do we listen to a new record in many ways? So I think really taking that time and, as you might have gathered from like the different projects, it's like I'll sit on one concept for just a super long time.
Shuhan asks, what's your biggest inspiration?
That's a really good question. For me, I would say that, one of the questions that I'm constantly thinking about because there's so much in the world to be inspired by, right? Is really this question of like lineage and time, you know? I was thinking about this the other day, actually in conversation with someone about like, oh, if I told my grandmother like, oh, so we have this thing called AI now, and here's some of the things that we do with it. Just kind of imagining her reaction. And it might seem like a very simple thought exercise to do, but I do think, it really forces me to, if I have this idea or if I'm like thinking through something, to really thinking about it at like this bigger scale of time, not just the present or the next 5 years, but also like into the future. I think that really, is one of the things that influences like my recent interest in like herbs and heritage seeds and like looking through things microscopically, rather than just like, oh, how can I make like this new or design this new piece of tech to like solve or like do something.
Okay, questions are rolling in now. Bolar asks, what would you say are the main drivers behind your work? Are they also lineage and time or more political?
That's a great question. So I'm going to give a very Berkeley answer and say that everything is political, right? Especially when you start thinking about history. And, there's, of course, the age-old adage, like, those who have power are the ones who write history. But it's not only that, but like, what do we consider valid forms of knowledge, right? That has been shaped by power, by colonialism. When we think of like this notion of rationality, quote unquote, as like the kind of epicenter of engineering, well, if you trace that through history, through time, you'll find that it has very much to do with like these Western Enlightenment ideals. And that was essentially tied to imperialism and colonialism. So I think, in many ways, like when I talk about like herbs or food or like these other ways of knowing, I'm always trying to like play with that, is like, what are these other ways of experience or knowing or like being really slow and like having collective knowledge that can kind of push that, right? So I would say it's like very, maybe like not overtly political, but embedded in that is definitely this interest in power. I mean, I'm also a Scorpio sun, which I don't know if that explains my obsession with power and where to find the nexus of it.
We've got a comment here from Jaslyn. She says, not exactly a question, but speaking of feeding AI, it made me think about how right before joining this call, I read that Apple and UCLA are teaming up to research whether data like facial expressions, audio, and speed of typing could be used to help diagnose depression in iPhone users. So that's just an insert here from Jaslyn, who we're glad is here. She's been very influential in getting the DT Cloud Salon going. Xiaowei, I want to ask something about a blockchain chicken farm, and it sort of gets back to the comment you made when you were answering my question about slowness, about a book taking 3 years to write. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what it's been like once the book is out there. I love the book and recommend it to a lot of people. I don't, and I think the reaction has been good, but what's it been like once it's out there and you're sort of absorbing people's reactions? I don't know exactly how long it's been out there, but it's been out there for long enough that you could garner reactions. What has this experience been like?
I think it's a moment in which it really made me think about even more like, there's definitely been some reactions of people being like, oh God, this book is like a horrible leftist diatribe against tech. And this author is like lacks total common sense about the free market, because the free market is great. And I think it prompts this question of like, well, at which point, there's always the kind of like, oh, like we should like engage in dialogue. But at which point is there like this just deep-seated ideological wall? So that's been like a really, that just sits on my mind a lot. Because a lot of the times it's like, starting to like have these really interesting conversations. Also, a lot of the people that I came into contact with, like during the research process that I write about in the book, for them, I love getting reactions from them because they're just like, this is so bizarre that people are interested in my life like this. And I'm like, well, I hope that, you get more customers for your oyster farm. So that side has been really beautiful to see. The other side has, I'm just constantly thinking about.
Does it depress you?
No, because, again, like I think history is this really powerful thing. There's actually this really great lecture from Robin D.G. Kelly. He's, in the context of, he's talking about the concept of racial capitalism and explaining it to kind of 101 class. But he makes this incredible remark where he's like, well, we think of change in the world as like, we need to garner these mass movements. But he was like, but if you look at it historically, it's actually like, pockets of people who like are really on the same page for like pushing for things, right? So I think in that sense, I'm like, okay, it's like not about, we need to like have everyone like question and critique the free market. It's about having, what are the ways to like just have a richer conversation as well in certain pockets. I don't know. I mean, that's just how I'm thinking at this moment. Maybe it'll change in a few years.
We've got another question from Bowler here. Do you have any advice for current students working with different media/technology about embracing the different affordances and politics of the media they are working with?
Yeah, so I think there's so many incredible, powerful strategies, right? There's a whole set of artists that I can think of who are really trying to like push on this, right? I just saw this incredible piece by the artist, American artist, and they were actually subverting like this notion of master and slave in circuitry. There's other artists, actually, I think quite a few of them who have been part of the Cloud Salon, like, Lauren McCarthy, he was also like, thinking through this, right? I think there's oftentimes, I feel like in the very traditional, like science technology studies critique world, it's like, this tech, like it has a military origin, and because of its origin, like we can't use it. But I think there's this beautiful way in which artists, especially those, if you're trying to like think through different ways of knowing as like equally valid and important, where, ultimately like tech and media, it's like a tool for doing certain things, right? One of the, one of the most inspiring movements that I think about, like the ACT UP movement, like they use so much media. And it was kind of like this pursue all strategies, right, of like communication and subversion. So I think in that sense, like, recognizing that ultimately, like all of these are tools and how can we use them and also subvert them and play with them or like co-opt them, right? That's been on my mind recently.
All right, I think we probably have time for one more question. And wow, they're pouring in now. I'm going to turn to Bowen, who asks, considering language as a media, what is the feeling of making work in a bilingual environment? And he adds that he's super interested in the view of standing out of the system to kind of resonate with the public policy in China. How do you feel when you take that role? It's in the chat.
Yeah.
if you want to read it.
Yeah. So that is a really great question. I was actually like thinking of talking about this recently with someone who does this great project called the Nomadic Department of the Interior, which is like trying to unpack indigeneity in Guizhou and like all these data centers from like Apple that are coming in, and especially indigenous land rights in China, which we normally don't think about. It's a great project. Y'all should check it out. And I think there's this way in which, like both like activism has this like very different understanding in China itself, right? Where it's like you might work with the system, you might work against the system sometimes, and it's all about like knowing the boundaries of that. I think actually this goes to the question of bilinguality, where I think bilingualism, it allows you to be like, oh, sometimes, I'm like code switching, right? Sometimes I use English, sometimes I use Chinese. If that maybe someone who's in the audience who's a Chinese speaker is like a police officer or something like that, you switch to English. And so I think it is this tool of code switching that allows this kind of navigation and subversion. Yeah.
So we'll end with a question from RT, who asks, do you have advice for artists working with machine learning in terms of being more cognizant of the energy consumption?
Yeah, so I think this is actually a tricky question. I think it's like something that's on everyone's minds, right? Because it's like, there's like on one hand, like us as like individual artists who are using machine learning, like, which I love, like there's so many interesting like projects coming out of that. I don't think that it's going to be like, I think it's the same way where it's like, oh, vote with your wallet, or as if like individual change is like, the only avenue to address these larger questions, right? Like if we look at overall greenhouse gas emissions, I think like something like agriculture is actually like 1/3 of it, all these other things, right? And so I think we need to be asking like better questions around like, energy use of computing that aren't just like, oh, is my energy use bad? Can I like buy some personal carbon offsets? I think it's like really some structural changes around like, well, wait a second. Like everyone in North America, we have like electricity access power. We're using like a ton of like coal and whatever. And then there's whole pockets of the world that like don't even have access to electricity. Like at a global scale, what are the forces shaping these? Like what's the structural forces? So I think that's like the questions we should be thinking through.
And I think that is a perfect place to end this at what is really the start of an even bigger conversation. Xiaowei, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you here. I think you've gotten people thinking in many, many different directions. We very much appreciate the generosity of your time, the various ways you've shared with Parsons over recent years, and thank you so much for coming. It's just been really great.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for all the wonderful questions.
So with that, we'll sign off, and everyone be well and enjoy your celebration of the Moon Festival, which I guess is kind of over now, but maybe not. I don't know. Goes on for a while. Anyway, be well all. Bye-bye.
Take care.